The north is cold and full of whispers.
The weirwood leaves had turned the color of dried blood by October. They hung from white branches above the pool in the Winterfell godswood, each one catching the light of the single torch Eddard Stark had planted in the mud at his feet, and they moved without wind. The old gods did not need wind to speak. They spoke in the kind of quiet that pressed against a man's ears the way deep water pressed against his chest. Ned sat at the edge of the pool, with both hands submerged to the wrist. The water was cold enough to hurt. He had been sitting like this for some time. Long enough that the torch had burned down a finger's width. Long enough that the godswood had accepted him back into its stillness and stopped listening for human movement. He was thinking about Bran. Then he heard her. Catelyn came through the trees without a torch, because she knew this godswood the way she now knew most things Stark, thoroughly, and was something short of love, but honest. She had been at Bran's bedside since the afternoon. She came into the clearing and stopped a few paces from her husband, and neither of them said anything for a moment. The brook that ran along the eastern edge of the godswood made its sound. It hadn't frozen yet. It would. "He's sleeping," Catelyn said. Lewin gave him milk of the poppy. Ned did not lift his hands from the water. And the man? Dead, before he could be questioned. A pause. The knife was still on the floor when I found it. Ned pulled his hands from the pool. He held them in the cold air until they stopped dripping, and he looked at them the way a man looked at something familiar that had become strange. He had killed men with these hands, commanded armies, delivered judgments. He had carried a baby down from a burning tower and taken it 1,000 miles and called it his own, and he had never once let himself stop long enough to understand the full cost of that. Now the cost had come to Bran's room with a Valyrian steel dagger. "Valyrian steel," he said. Not a question. "Catbone handle," Catelyn said. "There is not a common sellsword in the Seven Kingdoms who owns Valyrian steel. There is not an uncommon one." The torch crackled. Something moved in the high branches, a crow settling, and then the godswood was still again. They both knew what it meant. The Lannisters, a royal family who had descended on Winterfell 3 weeks ago with 300 horses and the pretense of old friendship, and who had left behind a boy comatose in his bed, and a knife meant to finish what the tower fall had started. They both knew. And below that knowing, something colder. King's Landing. The offer Robert had made. The position Ned had accepted, in the way a man accepted a door being opened for him when he had not yet seen the wall it led to. "You have to go," Catelyn said. She meant, "You gave your word. Ned Stark does not break his word. I know. Then we discuss what we can do with the time we have." He looked at her then. In 11 years of marriage, Catelyn Tully had surprised him perhaps 4 or 5 times. This was not one of those moments. She had already done her thinking. She had arrived at the godswood to discuss a plan, not to share her grief, and that. More than the cold water, more than the dead assassin, more than anything, was what steadied him. He said, "The Reach." She was quiet for a moment, not uncertain. Processing. "The Tyrells are status seekers," she said. "Yes, they backed Robert because Robert won. They will back whoever wins next," Ned said. "The question is, who reaches them first?" Catelyn looked at the weirwood face carved into the heart tree. The carved face looked back at both of them with the expression it had always had. Ancient, patient, knowing nothing and everything at once. She had never worshipped the old gods. She had married into their godswood and made her peace with them the way a practical woman made peace with many things, by working around them. "Robb is 15, she said. "He is the hope of the North," Ned said, which is not the same as being 15. She understood him. That was the thing about 15 years of marriage. The gap between what a man said and what he meant grew shorter, until, sometimes, they were the same length. Robb was 15 and capable and brave and his father's son in every way that mattered, and in several ways that kept Ned awake at night. He was also the only card Winterfell held that Highgarden might want to hold in return. "If we move first," Catelyn said slowly, "before the Lannisters think to. Before they've had time to settle into their grip on the capital, a betrothal negotiation," Ned said. "Not an alliance demand. Not desperation. An offer between houses. The Tyrells will not consider you an equal." "No," he stood, and the mud let go of his boots with a quiet sound. "But they will consider Robb promising. And they will consider the Lannisters dangerous. and Olenna Tyrell has been weighing those two facts in combination for longer than either of us has been worrying about them." He found her eyes. He did not say, "I am afraid." He did not say, "I do not know if I will come back from King's Landing." He did not say, "I know what happened to my father and my brother the last time a Stark trusted a king's hospitality in the south." Rickard Stark had ridden to King's Landing under the Mad King's summons and burned alive in his armor in the throne room. Brandon had been made to watch, and then strangled with a device that tightened when he struggled. The last two Stark men to trust a king's invitation had died within an hour of each other and left behind nothing but grief and a war. He said none of this. He would not say it. He said, "I will write tonight." He wrote by a single candle in his solar, the rest of the castle asleep around him. The words took longer than the thinking had. Formal courtly language, the kind Maester Luwin had drilled into him at 8 years old at this same desk, in what felt now like a different world, a world where Starks did not yet know how quickly kings could turn. An offer of betrothal negotiation. House Stark to House Tyrell. Terms generous without being desperate. Language controlled without being cold. Desperation was the one thing you could never put in a letter to Highgarden. Highgarden could smell it. His hands were not quite steady. He noticed this. He said nothing about it, even to himself. He finished the scroll. He sealed it with the direwolf pressed into gray wax, and sat there a moment with it held in both palms. A piece of parchment the length of his forearm. It either changed everything or changed nothing, and there was no way to know which until it was too late to change his mind. He had written letters before that carried that same weight. He had never gotten used to the feeling. He took it to the rookery himself in the hour before dawn. The ravens were restless in the dark, their black feathers catching the light of his lantern, their eyes quick and unreflective. He chose the bird Luwin had trained for the southwest routes, a large one, with a scar across its breast from some old injury nobody remembered. He tied the scroll to its leg. He carried it to the open window. He held it there for a moment, feeling the shift of its weight, the particular warmth of a living creature in cold air. Then he opened his hands. The raven climbed into the gray before sunrise and spiraled south, carrying the first move in a game Ned Stark had never wanted to play, toward a castle he had never visited, into the hands of a woman he had never met. He watched it until distance swallowed it, and the sky was just sky again. Robb did not know. Not yet. He was in the training yard at mid-morning when his father found him, a hard session with Theon, both of them sweat damp in the cold air, their breath coming in short white clouds against the gray stone of the yard. Jon watched from the fence rail with his arms crossed and the expression he wore when he had already found the technical error, and was deciding whether to say so. He said so. Robb told him to shut up, in the particular way brothers said shut up when they meant the opposite. Ned watched from the gate. The laugh. The ease of it. He stored it away the way he stored things he was afraid of losing. "Robb," he said, "the laughter did not exactly die. It became something else." Later, in the great hall with the fire burning low and the household moving around them in the ordinary business of midday, Ned sat his son down and told him what needed to be told. Not everything, what Robb needed now, that a marriage was being arranged, that the family was Tyrell, that it was not sentiment but strategy, and that the difference mattered enormously. Robb said very little. He was 15, and he had his father's eyes and his father's way of receiving difficult news, taking each part of it apart carefully until he could see all the edges. "Do I have a choice?" Robb asked. Ned considered the easier answer. He decided against it. "You have the choice of how you carry it." A silence. The fire shifted. "You will not marry this girl because I think she is suitable," Ned said. "You will marry her because your house needs her family, and her family needs yours. Do you understand the difference?" Robb was 15. He looked at his father the way 15 looked at something that would only be understood from a greater distance, from somewhere further along in time when the full shape of it became clear. "I think so," he said. Ned wanted to say, "I am sorry." He said instead, "You are the hope of the North." Robb carried both meanings away without knowing it. The reply came 11 days later, a single raven at dawn, bearing the Tyrell rose stamped in gold wax. Ned opened it at his desk before anyone else was awake, before the house had begun its noise. The message was remarkably brief. Olenna's hand was in the economy of it. No wasted words, no courtly throat-clearing, no performance of reluctance. Yes, terms to be discussed. A party will come north. Ned read it once, then again. Then, he held the edge of the scroll over his candle flame and watched it catch. It blackened at the corner first, then the fire found the wax seal, and the rose bubbled and ran. The parchment curled inward as it burned, the way parchment did, as though trying to protect what was written on it. It did not protect it. Within a minute there was nothing left except a shape of ash on his desk that kept the scroll's form for a breath before it collapsed into nothing. He sat in the dark room with the smell of it. He thought about his father, about the armor that had become a furnace. He thought about his brother Brandon, about the strangling frame and what it did to a man who fought it. He thought about King's Landing and what the South had taken from the Starks the last time the Starks had gone down to meet it. Then he thought about a raven already flying north from Highgarden, about a girl who would ride into winter for the first time, and about a boy in a training yard who had been handed two meanings of the same sentence without being told which one was true. He reached for a clean piece of parchment. He went to write to Catelyn. The outrider came first, a single man on a horse the color of dark honey, wearing green and gold and moving up the King's Road at a pace that suggested he had been riding since before dawn. The stable boys saw him from the gate tower and ran to tell someone who could tell someone who mattered. By the time the message reached the great hall, Robb was already at the window. Then the column appeared at the tree line. It moved slowly, the way things moved that were not accustomed to cold roads and did not intend to be hurried by them. 24 horses in green lacquer caparisons. A baggage train of 6 wagons, each one heavier than the last. A pair of armored knights riding ahead of a closed carriage, their shields bearing the Tyrell rose, and behind the carriage 4 ladies' maids on palfreys, sitting straight-backed against the wind with the particular expression of Southron women who had been told it would be cold and had not been told the truth. A septa. A maester's assistant. A servant carrying a wooden box that no one had set down since Bitterbridge. The Winterfell household came out to the yard. They couldn't help it. There was something about the column that demanded watching, the way a fire demanded watching, not because it was dangerous, but because it was different. The colors alone. In autumn the north had gone gray and brown and the particular dark green of evergreens, and here came gold lacquer and silk the color of new leaves and something underneath it all, a smell, even from a distance, that the stable boys couldn't name. Rosewater and warm horses and dried lavender from a place where lavender grew without being coaxed. Against the kennels and the coal smoke and the cold iron smell of Winterfell in October, it was almost disorienting. Robb stood in the yard with the words Lewin had helped him prepare arranged in his head like a formation of soldiers. Formal, correct, he had practiced them twice that morning. The carriage stopped. A groom moved to set the step. The door opened before he reached it. Margaery Tyrell did not wait for the step. She descended with one hand on the carriage door and one foot finding the cobblestone directly, and she stood in the Winterfell yard and looked up at the towers, and she did not perform what she felt. The towers were larger than she had imagined, older, more serious than anything the Reach had prepared her for. The Reach built things to be looked at. Highgarden's towers reaching up in elegant tapering lines that said, "Look at us," and these towers did not say that. These towers said nothing. They had been here for 8,000 years, and they would be here for 8,000 more, and they did not require anyone's opinion. She took a breath. The cold hit the back of her throat like river water. She looked at Robb Stark, who was standing with his prepared words arranged in his head, and she said, "I should have brought thicker cloaks." The formation dissolved. Something in his face shifted, not relief exactly, but an adjacent thing. He said, "We have spares," and then immediately looked as though he wished he had said something better. "Good," she said. "I'll need 3. Catelyn had arranged the formal reception with the thoroughness she brought to everything. Assembled household in the great hall, household banners, the correct precedence of persons along the tables, warming fires in every hearth. She stood at the top of the hall with the expression of a woman who had hosted kings, and found the experience instructive. She watched Margaery Tyrell move through the ceremony the way water moved, finding the shape of the vessel, taking it, remaining water. Margaery knew ceremony the way she knew breathing. She had been trained in it from the age she could stand still long enough to train. She smiled at the right faces, inclined her head at the right moments, said things that were warm without being familiar and formal without being cold. There was no seam visible in any of it. You could not find the place where the performance began because there was no clear place where it ended. But her attention was everywhere else. She clocked who stood nearest to whom, which bannerman's wife wore clothes too fine for a household servant and too plain for a lord's lady, where the direwolf kennels were from the great hall door, the sound of steel from the training yard, the specific way Robb Stark stood slightly apart from the dark-haired young man beside him, not unfriendly apart, but the particular careful distance of someone who had spent years learning to manage the space between himself and where he actually wanted to stand. She catalogued all of it. She did not look like she was cataloging anything. Then she found Sansa. Sansa was everything the song said a lord's daughter should be: copper hair braided properly, a dress that fit, blue eyes that went wide when Margaery crossed the hall toward her. She had been expecting courtesy. A nod, perhaps, an acknowledgement, the kind that high-born women gave each other when rank required it and warmth did not. Margaery asked her what she loved about Winterfell. Not the correct opening, not what the ceremony required. Just the question, direct, with the particular quality of attention that said the answer would actually be listened to. Sansa blinked. She opened her mouth. She started talking about the godswood and the glass gardens and the sound the castle made at night when the wind came off the moors, and her voice did something complicated halfway through, because no one in her memory had ever asked Sansa Stark about Winterfell when King's Landing and tournaments and songs about knights were available subjects instead. She stopped herself. She pressed her lips together. She held herself very still. Margaery said, "The glass gardens sound extraordinary. Will you show me in the morning?" Sansa said she would, and then said nothing else, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't be too much. Margaery moved on, and then stopped. Arya was at the back of the hall. She had been brought here under some negotiated terms that everyone present understood were fragile, dressed in something that was technically a dress, and had clearly been losing a battle with its wearer since the moment it was put on. Her hair had been combed in the general direction of order. She had the expression of someone calculating the fastest route to the door. Margaery walked directly to her, past the bannermen's wives, past the steward, past the careful arrangement of precedents Catelyn had organized. She stopped in front of a 9-year-old girl in a losing dress and said, "I was told you were hard to find." Arya stared at her. She tried on unfriendly and found it didn't quite fit the situation. "Who told you that?" "My grandmother," Margaery said. "She makes it her business to know about the people she's sending me to meet. Your grandmother sounds like she's annoying." "Deeply," Margaery said. "You'd like her." Neither of them had planned the godswood. Margaery had gone because her rooms were in the guest tower, and the guest tower in Winterfell smelled of cold stone and old fire, and something underneath that, something she could not name. And she needed air that wasn't filtered through 4 feet of castle wall. She had wrapped herself in 2 of Winterfell's spare cloaks and gone looking for outside. Robb had gone because he always went when he needed to think, and he had been thinking since the carriage door opened. They found each other at the Heart Tree. He arrived from the north path. She had come in from the east. The brook was making its noise. The weirwood leaves hung black in the dark, the carved face in the trunk watching both of them with absolute indifference to whatever they were feeling. They were both slightly embarrassed for a moment. Then, after the moment, they were slightly not. They sat on the great roots that broke the ground around the pool. The cold came up through the moss and through both of Margaery's borrowed cloaks, and she did not say anything about it. He asked about the Reach, because he genuinely did not know and had no reason to pretend otherwise. She talked about it the way people talked about places they had loved their entire lives without being told to, wheat fields running to the horizon in summer. The color they turned in the last weeks before harvest, the mander in afternoon light, the smell of roses and red clover in the warm months. He listened like someone who had been cold his entire life. Not sad about it, just attentive, the way you paid attention to something you had never had, but recognized the shape of. She asked about the north. He described winter as a man described something he had always loved, which was not the same as something he enjoyed. The distinction was in his voice rather than his words, and she heard it. She said, "My grandmother told me to watch out for Northmen. She said you were severe and proud and cold." He said, "Your grandmother's reputation reached us here." She went quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, "Don't tell her that. She'll be insufferable." He laughed, the genuine kind, the kind that had nothing prepared about it. And the godswood held the sound for a moment before the brook took it back. And the weirwood watched, and the leaves hung still, and that was the moment. Not the politics, not the letters, not the troop counts or the grain supply or the Rose Road distances. Just a laugh in the dark under a tree older than both their houses. Ned rode out before full dawn. The yard was quiet. Gray light, cold breath, horses stamping. His household guard formed up at the gate. His saddlebags were packed. Maester Lewin had the household rosters and the instructions. Everything that could be arranged had been arranged. He looked back once from the gate. In the yard below the main steps, Robb and Margaery standing side by side. She was wrapped in the northern cloaks, 3 of them now layered impractically, and she was saying something he couldn't hear. Robb was listening with his whole body turned toward her, the way he listened to things that mattered. They were standing the way 2 people stood when they had not yet noticed they were doing it. Like a unit. Like something that had found its natural spacing. Neither of them was watching Ned leave. He watched them a moment longer. Something eased in his chest. Not fully, but fractionally, in the particular way that a man who had made an impossible bet eased when the first card landed in his favor. Then the gates opened. He rode through. He did not look back again. Behind him, the gates of Winterfell closed. Robb stood in the yard and did not watch his father's receding figure. He was already looking south. Somewhere behind his eyes, something was calculating distances he had not yet been asked to cross, moving pieces across a map he hadn't been handed yet. Beside him, Margaery said nothing. She watched the road where the column had gone, and she thought about the godswood, and she thought about what her grandmother had said the morning she left High Garden: pay attention to everything. The north does not give second chances. The wind came off the moors. It was colder than yesterday. She pulled the cloaks tighter and said nothing, and waited. And the yard went about its business around them as though nothing had changed. Everything had changed. King's Landing did not sleep. It merely changed what it was doing. The harbor noise began before dawn, the creak of mooring lines, the knock of hulls against the dock, men calling to each other across water in the particular shorthand of people who started work before the city was ready for them. By the time the sun cleared the bay, the streets were already loud, the smells already layered, salt and fish and horse dung and bread from the bakeries near the Street of Flour, and underneath all of it, always, the smell of too many people living in too small a space and managing it imperfectly. It was a city that wore its own excess like a man wore a coat he had put on drunk. You could see it didn't quite fit. Everyone had agreed to say nothing. Ned Stark had been hand to the king for 6 weeks. He hated every hour of it with a measured, contained hatred that he expressed to no one, and that had been growing since approximately his 3rd day in residence, when he had sat down in the small council chamber and understood that the work done here was not governance but performance, and that the audience for the performance was the performance itself. He had discovered what Jon Arryn found. He had sat with it. He had decided to tell Robert. This was where he acted differently than he might have. In another life, he would have warned Cersei first, given her the chance to flee with her children, offered her the courtesy that his honor demanded even of enemies. He would have moved carefully, by the code he had always kept. But the Raven to Highgarden had already gone. The Tyrell alliance was in motion somewhere to the south, and Ned Stark, knowing for the first time in his life that he was not entirely alone in what was coming, dispensed with the courtesy. He went directly to Robert. He would not give the Lannisters the warning he could no longer afford to give. He told him on a Tuesday morning. In a corridor of the Red Keep between the throne room and the king's chambers, because Robert was late for something and moving quickly, and the alternative was waiting for an appointment that Cersei's people controlled the scheduling of. He told him quickly and plainly. He used clear sentences. He said what he had found. Robert stopped walking. It is sometimes useful, before examining how a thing falls, to understand the exact weight of it. Robert Baratheon had taken the Iron Throne through blood and battle, and the deaths of men he loved. He had spent 17 years on it. He had believed, in the particular way that exhausted men believed things they needed to be true, that what he had built was real, the realm, the rule, the family at the center of it. He had believed it the way a drunk believed he was sitting up straight. Ned had just told him he was lying on the floor. What happened in that corridor moved quickly. Cersei had people everywhere, and news of Ned reaching the king reached her before Robert could act on what he had been told. Littlefinger happened. The gold cloaks happened. Steel crossed steel on marble floors, and men shouted in spaces not built for shouting, and Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, Hand of the King, found himself at the bottom of the Red Keep in a cell 8 feet by 8 feet, with water coming in under the door. In the dark, he did not despair. He thought. He thought about Robb, about the words he had left him with, about the instructions coded into casual conversation over the weeks before things moved. He had known this might come. He had not known when, which was worse than knowing, but he had known it was possible. He thought, did it reach them? Did the raven reach Highgarden? He did not know the answer. He sat with the question the way he had sat with cold water in the Godswood pool. He let it hurt, and he did not move. The raven reached Winterfell on a night with no moon. It was not Ned's raven. Ned was in a cell, and his correspondence was not his own. It was a household guard's raven, a man named Jory Castle, who had survived the corridor and run, which was not cowardice but instruction. Because Ned had told him, if something happens, run north and send word. He had given Jory the words to send. 3 lines. Enough. It arrived in the rookery at the 2nd hour of night, and Maester Luwin brought it to the great hall, where Robb was still up over maps he had been studying for 3 weeks, with the particular obsessiveness of someone who understood that maps were about to become urgent. Margaery was at the other end of the table. She had been reading household accounts. This was not what household accounts were supposed to look like from a visiting betrothed, but no one had told her to stop. Luwin put the scroll on the table in front of Robb. Robb read it. His face did not change. He read it again. The hall fire had burned down to coals, and the room had gone dark at the edges, and the scroll in his hands was 3 lines of a man's handwriting in the kind of haste that bent the letters. Catelyn appeared from the corridor. She had heard Luwin's footsteps. She had learned, in the weeks since Ned left, to hear things she would not have heard before. She read his face before she read the scroll. The silence in the great hall was its own specific weight. Not empty. Full of everything being understood at once. The trap, the design of it, the particular cruelty of a move made by people who had calculated that a man's honor was a mechanism and not a virtue. Robb set the scroll down on the table. "Call the banners," he said. 2 words, not shouted, not broken, not inflected with anything that could be called feeling. The exact register his father would have used. The great hall heard it, and went still the way rooms went still before action, that specific held-breath moment before everything committed to moving in one direction. Margaery looked at him for the length of a breath. She read his face the way she had been reading it for weeks, the set of his jaw, the stillness that meant the decision was already made and the only thing left was execution. Then she gathered her skirts and went to her rooms to write to her grandmother. The Mander ran dark in autumn, the water the color of old iron, and the fields of Bitterbridge on either side of it had been harvested a month ago and stood bare under a sky that couldn't decide between clouds and clearing. It was not a beautiful place in October. It was a useful one. Wide enough to muster 50,000 men without confusion. Close enough to the Rose Road for rapid movement either east or north, far enough from King's Landing that what assembled here could not be seen from King's Landing's walls. The torches in the command tent were burning when Olenna Tyrell entered it. Mace was already at the table, which meant he had been there long enough to settle into the chair at its head and begin feeling like the person who would decide things. Lord Randall Tarley stood at the map with his arms crossed. Loras sat to Mace's left with the expression he wore when he was controlling something that wanted very much to be rage. 3 other lords waited along the wall, Fossaway, Rowan, Ambrose, standing because the most important person in the room had not yet sat down. Olenna sat down. The lord sat. "The Raven from the North," Mace said, which was how he began most sentences when he was nervous, by naming the thing they were all already thinking about. "I've read it," Olenna said. "We need more information before we need to move," she said, "before the lion settles. Once Tywin Lannister has his hand around King's Landing's throat, we are negotiating from the outside of a closed door, and Lannister doors close very completely." She looked at Tarly. He was the only one in the room she never wasted softness on, because he didn't want it, and wouldn't know what to do with it. How long to full muster? Every banner. This ground. Tarly said, 10 days. 7, she said. He looked at her. It was not an insulted look. It was the look of a man revising a number he had left room in. 7, he agreed. Good. She looked around the table. Mace had opened his mouth and closed it again, which was the most useful thing he had done in the meeting so far. We are not deliberating. We are executing. The deliberation happened when we sent a girl north in a carriage, and a raven went south from Winterfell, and the Lannister who sent an assassin to kill a 7-year-old boy in his bed decided the question of whose side we were on. Is anyone at this table unclear on that? No one was unclear on that. The Tyrell banners went up over the Mander before the next morning's light. Green and gold against an October sky that had finally decided on clouds, the rows of high gardens snapping in a wind off the river. And behind the banners, the lords, Hightower, coming down from the south with 5,000 of the finest heavy infantry in the 7 kingdoms, Fossaway, Rowan, Ambrose, the Redwyne fleet already receiving its orders via Raven. Lord Paxter Redwyne reading the message at anchor in the arbor and looking south toward Lannisport with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this particular assignment. 30 years of peacetime, and a fleet that had been sitting in the harbor watching the fish. 60,000 men would march within 7 days. Tywin Lannister heard the news on the 13th day of the Riverlands campaign. His field camp was a model of functional austerity, no excess, nothing decorative, every element in its place for a reason. His men knew it, and conducted themselves accordingly. The maps on his table were updated each morning by 2 scribes who had been doing this for 20 years and knew exactly how much space he needed around each annotation. The chair he sat in when he worked was not comfortable. He did not sit in it for comfort. The messenger was one of his own outriders, a reliable man with a scar across his left eyebrow who had been riding hard from the south. He came in, went to one knee, placed the sealed scroll on the table. Tywin broke the seal. He read. He read it again. He set the scroll down. He did not move. This was the tell. The men in the tent knew it, though none of them would have articulated it. When Tywin Lannister was surprised at something manageable, he reacted. When he was surprised at something that required a full accounting of its consequences before any reaction was appropriate, he went absolutely still, like a fire that had run out of air. Still burning, but contained. Kevan Lannister said, carefully, "My lord." Tywin stood. He went to the map table. He looked at the full spread of it, his forces at their current positions, the Trident fords, the distance to Harrenhal, the King's Road north, the Gold Road west. His finger found Bitterbridge. He held it there a moment, then moved it north, northeast, calculating. His eyes doing the work faster than the finger. They will come through the Rose Road, he said. Quiet, no heat in it whatsoever, which puts them in the Riverlands before first snow. His finger moved north again, to where a smaller marker indicated Robb Stark's host, already in the field, already moving. And the boy's army is in the field. He did not say the rest. He didn't need to. In the silence that followed, in the particular quality of Tywin Lannister's stillness, every man in that tent arrived at the same place at the same moment. The Starks had not moved on sentiment. They had moved on strategy. Someone had seen this coming months before the pieces were in position. Someone had written a letter, probably at night, by a single candle, before Ned Stark ever rode south. Someone had understood that the north alone was beatable and the north with Highgarden was not, and had moved accordingly, and Tywin had not seen it. He stood at his map and looked at the geometry of what had been done to him. It was, he would never say aloud, nearly admirable. Nearly, he reached for a piece of parchment. He called for a raven. His scribe was already standing, already with ink ready, because he had learned, 20 years of this, to be ready when the stillness ended. The raven was bound for the east. The chapter does not say to whom. The letter bore the lion's seal. The army moved at night the way something enormous moved when it had decided not to announce itself, slowly, with the particular controlled noise of 50,000 men and horses who had been told, clearly and once, that silence was not optional. Torches threaded between black trees like a river of fire following its own course. The direwolf banners and the Tyrell roses together overhead, invisible in the dark but present in the way that mattered, which was in the minds of the men carrying them. The Whispering Wood was named for the sound the trees made when the wind came through from the west. Tonight there was no wind. Tonight the wood was genuinely quiet, which was, in its way, more unsettling than the usual sound. As though the trees had decided to pay attention. Robb's command tent had been up for 3 hours before the army arrived around it. Inside, maps, candlelight, the smell of tallow and wet leather and gray wind, who was not asleep. The wolf lay with his head on his forepaws near the tent's center post, pale eyes moving between the men around the table without urgency. He had been restless since mid-afternoon. Robb had learned to register this without making a point of it. Grey Wind's restlessness was information. Lord Randyll Tarly stood across the table with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had decided nothing yet. He was 51 years old and had built a military reputation that preceded him into every room he entered. And he had opinions about how battles should be organized that he communicated with the economy of someone who did not believe the world needed to hear him repeat himself. He had been testing the boy for 3 weeks, asking questions in the particular way that separated genuine inquiry from the kind that was designed to reveal gaps. Robb had answered each one. Tarly had not yet said he was satisfied, which meant he was not yet satisfied, but the questions had changed in character. Less can you think and more have you thought of this specific thing, which was its own kind of progress. The coordination of the southern charge, Tarly said, and how you propose to manage it without signal fires visible to Lannister outriders. The tent was quiet. Theon was at the far end of the table looking at the map the way he looked at most complex things, with the expression of a man who understood the broad outline and was filling in the specifics as they were explained to him. The northern lords, Umber, Glover, Karstark, waited. The Reach Knights waited. Robb put his finger on the western edge of the wood. The southern cavalry doesn't move on a signal, he said. They move on a time. Tarly's men know the hour. When the hour comes, they move, regardless of what they've heard from the north. The coordination isn't managed. It's built into the plan before the plan starts. He looked at Tarly. If I'm relying on signals in the dark, I've already made a mistake. Tarly looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. Once, no elaboration, no praise, just the nod, the one that meant the answer had passed through whatever standard Tarly applied to answers, and come out the other side intact. Umber said something loud and approving. Umber usually did. Robb did not look pleased about the approval. He looked like someone who understood that approval from Umber was easier to earn than approval from Tarly, and therefore worth proportionally less. At the edge of the tent, Margaery stood with a cup she had not been drinking from. She had been there since the council began, which she had managed by being there before anyone thought to establish who was supposed to be there. She was watching Randyll Tarly, not Robb. Tarly, the way he held his shoulders, which direction his attention moved when he was considering rather than when he had decided. She was learning him the way she learned things she expected to need later. Robb had noticed she was there. He had not mentioned it, neither had Tarly, which was its own answer about what Tarly thought of her presence. Tarly ignored everything he considered irrelevant, which meant he had not decided she was irrelevant. They broke for the positions an hour before midnight. The Lannister rear column was 800 men and moving without urgency. Because rear columns moved without urgency, because that was what it meant to be a rear column. They were experienced soldiers with good weapons and the particular confidence of men attached to an army that had been winning, which was a different kind of confidence from the kind earned battle by battle. Earned confidence sat in the chest. Borrowed confidence sat closer to the skin. The northern cavalry came from the west. It was not, from the Lannister perspective, the sound of horses that registered first. It was the change in the wood, the birds going up from the trees in a dark rush, the specific absence of the small sounds that forest made when left alone. The outrider who noticed it had time to open his mouth before the tree line became something else entirely. Robb's cavalry did not shout. This had been specified. They rode out of the dark in silence, and the silence was worse than noise would have been, because noise was normal. Noise was what soldiers expected, and this was not that. Then the Reach Knights came from the south. The sound of them was a different register entirely, heavier, the ground registering it before the ears did. That specific rolling vibration that 40 armored warhorses produced when they moved at speed. The Tyrell rose on every chest, gold-catching torchlight. The horses were larger than northern stock, trained for the shock of impact, and they struck the Lannister column's southern flank with the organized devastation of something that had been built specifically for this. The column folded at both ends simultaneously. The men in the middle understood what was happening before they could do anything useful about it. Jaime Lannister was not in the rear column. He was 300 yards north on the main road when the sounds began, and he understood them immediately, because he was the Kingslayer and the finest sword in the Seven Kingdoms, and he had been in enough engagements to parse the acoustics of disaster before most men parsed the noise. He turned his horse. He made the calculation instantly. Ride to the column, reinforce. Cut through the northern attack and find a gap east. There was always a gap. There was always a move. He was wrong about this in a way he would not fully understand until later. He fought through to the rear column's remnant in the time it took the engagement to become a rout, which was not very long. He cut down 3 men who came at him from the trees with the efficiency of someone for whom killing had never required much effort. He found a space. He looked for the gap east. The wolf was there. It was sitting at the edge of the tree line 70 yards ahead, in the exact space where the gap was. Not moving, not threatening, just present, pale as stripped birch, enormous, its eyes catching the torchlight in the color that fire made when it burned very hot. It was looking at him the way things looked at problems they had already solved. Haim wheeled south. The gap south had 2 Reach Knights in it who had been placed there an hour ago by a 15-year-old reading a map in a tent. He wheeled north. The wolf had moved north. It was faster than a horse in the trees. He had not known that, and now he did. He fought for 20 minutes. The northerners who came at him paid for every minute, and he gave them nothing easily, and 3 more men died, learning what it cost to close with Jaime Lannister in open ground. But the numbers were what they were, and the wolf was what it was. And the gap never opened. Every direction he calculated had been calculated first. When Robb arrived, he was on horseback with 2 knights flanking him, and he was 15 years old, and he had blood on his jaw that wasn't his. He looked at Jaime Lannister in the torchlight without performance. "Yield," Robb said. Jaime looked at the positions. He counted what was countable. He ran the calculation he had been running for 20 minutes and arrived at the same answer he had been arriving at for 20 minutes. He threw down his sword. The camp 3 hours later was loud with the specific noise of northern men who had been waiting to fight Lannisters for months and had now done it. The Reach Knights moved through the same space with the manner of professionals who had done this before and found the rawness of it somewhat alarming in the abstract, though none of them said so. 2 cultures occupying the same victory, they didn't quite know what to make of each other yet. Margaery found Robb before any of his bannermen reached him. He was standing at the edge of the firelight, and he was covered in blood that belonged to other people, and he looked like someone who had spent the last 3 hours spending everything he had. She touched his face with 2 fingers, the left side, checking for wounds, quick and clinical. He stood still for it. Around them, 3 of his bannermen saw this and went very quiet. She stepped back. "Alive," she said, and she said it at a volume that carried. "The Kingslayer is alive and in our hands, and every lord in Westeros will hear that Robb Stark fights with his mind, and not just his sword." The quiet spread. She was not addressing Robb. She was addressing the men standing in the light around him, the ones who would carry the story back to their keeps. The ones whose letters to their families and their lieges would contain whatever framing they had been given in this moment. A dead Jaime Lannister was a Lannister killed in battle, which was a military fact. A living Jaime Lannister in chains was a demonstration of something more useful than military capability, and she had understood this 3 weeks ago, when she had mentioned it quietly to Robb and watched him think about it and agree. He looked at her. He nodded. He let her do it. The wagon was solid oak, and the chains were new, and Jaime sat in it with his back against the sideboard and his wrists resting on his knees, in the position of someone conserving energy, not despair. He was thinking. This was what Jaime Lannister did when everything else was unavailable, he thought. He had expected a northern rabble with a boy at its head. He had expected anger and momentum and the particular brittleness of an army driven by outrage rather than strategy. He had encountered something that had a southern intelligence behind its northern fury, and the combination had been seamless in a way that should not have been possible from the outside. Who planned this? He kept returning to it. The timing of the southern cavalry, the perplaced gap closures, the wolf positioned at the eastern exit, that was not a 15-year-old's plan alone. That was a 15-year-old executing a plan built with someone who understood what a flanking position required and where an escaping commander would run. When he learned, from a guard's overheard conversation, that Margaery Tyrell was in the camp, that she had been in the camp since the Mander, 3 weeks of March, that she attended the war councils, something arranged itself in his thinking. "The rose," he said. To no one. To the oak boards of the wagon. To the dark beyond the camp where the whispering wood had gone back to its usual sounds now that the business of the night was concluded. "Of course," he said. "They have the rose." The wagon moved north. The camp moved with it. Above the tree line, the sky had gone the particular gray that came before the first light, and somewhere in the dark ahead of them the trident made its sound, and behind them the whispering wood whispered, and Jaime Lannister sat in his chains and started calculating what came next. Riverrun sat at the confluence of 2 rivers, the way a man sat at a table he had owned for 1,000 years, with the absolute ease of something that had never considered being anywhere else. The Tumblestone came in from the east and the Red Fork from the south, and where they met they made a triangle of land that the Tully family had turned into a castle 3 centuries ago and had been defending effortlessly ever since, because water did most of the defending for them. In flood season the courtyard became an island. In all seasons the towers reflected in 2 rivers at once, the Tully blue and red and silver rippling in both directions, doubled. Today those reflections had company. The grey direwolf of House Stark flew from the eastern tower. The Tyrell rose flew from the western one. The Tully fish ran down the center keep. Between them, looking, some of the younger servants thought privately, slightly astonished to find itself in that particular company. Below, in the yard, northern men in mail and furs, Reach knights in lacquered plate, the odd Riverland soldier who had spent 2 months being fought over and had arrived at a species of battered pragmatism about it. They moved around each other in the courtyard the way people moved around furniture in an unfamiliar room, carefully, noting the edges. It was the first time all 3 allied families had been in one place. The weight of it was visible in how people stood. The great hall of Riverrun at midday sounded like 2 different arguments happening in the same language. The Northerners occupied the left side of the long tables. The Reach lords occupied the right. The seating had not been formally assigned, and had arranged itself that way within 10 minutes of the doors opening, which told you everything you needed to know about how naturally the 2 forces had integrated in 3 weeks of march. They had fought together with perfect coordination. They had eaten together with perfect separateness. It was the difference between professional respect and actual knowledge of each other, and the gap between those 2 things was the size of a Mander River. The Griadjon was speaking. He was always speaking. His voice occupied approximately 1/3 of any room he was in, regardless of competing noise, which was a useful quality in a battlefield commander, and a complicated one at a peace table. He was speaking about the vanguard, about who had held it at the Whispering Wood, and what the holding of it signified about the battle's character, and therefore about which men deserved which portion of whatever honor was being distributed. He spoke with total conviction, and no diplomatic instinct whatsoever, which would have been fine if Lord Randyll Tarly had not been sitting 11 feet away and had not formed his own opinion about the Vanguard weeks ago. Tarly set down his cup. The hall's ambient noise did not stop, but it shifted. People close enough to see Tarly's face adjusted their postures in the small, unconscious way that people adjusted when they sensed something was about to become a problem. The Vanguard, Tarly said to no one specifically, which meant to Umber specifically, was the Northern Infantry. That is correct. The Northern Infantry held position and drew the Lannister rear column's attention north. The cavalry engagement that actually broke the column came from the south. He said it with the precise flatness of a man reciting a military record, not arguing. The flatness was the argument. Umber turned his head. He was large enough that the turning of his head was its own event. Holding position in the dark without signal or support is how vanguards work, Tarly. I wouldn't expect a Reach Lord to, the Fossaway men, Margaery said. She said it from the middle of the table, which was not her seat, because she had been moving. She had been at the far end 30 seconds ago. Now she was in the center, refilling a cup she had borrowed from the nearest servant, saying something to the knight beside Lord Tarly's seat. Something that involved the Fossaway men and a specific moment in the engagement that Robb's battle report had detailed. The knight laughed. Genuine, the laugh was loud enough to interrupt the Greatjon's mounting reply and replace it with the need to understand what was funny. Umber's reply died without being delivered. The moment it would have occupied was gone. Robb, from the head of the table, watched her move back to her seat. He did the thing he had been doing for weeks, which was store it away. The specific mechanism of it, what she had seen from 30 feet away, how quickly she had moved to where she needed to be, the fact that she had used someone else's laugh as the instrument rather than her own voice. He was a good student of tactics. She was a different kind of tactician, and he was still working out the grammar of it. Tarly looked at the seat Margaery had returned to. Then he looked at his cup. He did not say anything. This was, from Tarly, equivalent to a standing ovation. Then the Greatjon stood up. It came the way it always came with Umber, loudly, without preamble, with the full weight of his conviction behind it, leaving no room for anyone to disagree before it was already in the air. He called for a king in the north. He called for it with his sword drawn, and his voice at its full considerable volume, and the northern lords responded the way they always responded to the Greatjon, calling for something, loudly, and with their own swords. The hall was noise and steel. Then Lord Mathis Rowan of Golden Grove stood. He was a Reach Lord of the old school, composed, formal, the kind of man who had been in rooms where things were decided for 30 years and knew how they worked. He waited for the northern lords to have their moment. He waited with patience that was itself a kind of statement. And when the noise had expressed itself and was looking for somewhere to go, he said, "King," in the north and the Reach. The silence that followed was different from the silence before it. The northern lords heard it and went still. The Reach lords heard it and straightened. Even the Tully men along the wall, who had been watching with the studied neutrality of people in someone else's argument, changed their posture. Mace Tyrell, from his seat 3 places from the head of the table, looked delighted in the uncomplicated way that Mace looked delighted at things that advanced the Tyrell name. He was the first lord to stand on the Reach side. Then Tarly, and the standing had nothing delighted about it. It was a decision, made and executed, which was how Tarly did everything. Margaery did not stand. She sat at Robb's right, and she watched him. He rose slowly. Not for effect. He rose the way he did everything now, with the weight of accumulated consequence in every movement, like someone who had stopped being able to do anything lightly. The hall found its quiet the way large rooms found quiet, in pieces. The noise folding back from the head of the table and moving outward until the last conversation stopped. He was 16. He looked older than 16 in the way that had nothing to do with his face and everything to do with his eyes. "I did not ride south to sit on a throne," he said. The hall was entirely still. "I rode south to bring my father home." A pause. Not for drama, but because the next sentence was heavier and needed its own space. "But if a throne is what it takes, then I will sit it." The roar was enormous. Catelyn found him in the Tully Solar an hour later. The solar was small and had been his grandfather's room before it was his great-uncle's, and the walls still smelled of old wood and river damp, which was the smell of every room and river run that had been here long enough to absorb the place. She was not celebrating. He had known she wouldn't be when he saw her face across the hall during the acclamation, the controlled expression of a woman computing consequences, not feeling the moment. "Joffrey will not negotiate," she said. "He is not capable of it, and Cersei won't allow it, because negotiation acknowledges that we have a position worth negotiating with. What they will do is use your father." "I know. A king cannot ransom his father without demonstrating that his father's life is worth more to him than the lives of the men who follow him. They will use that. They will use his location and his condition, and they will make you choose publicly between rescue and dignity. I know. Do you understand what they might do before any of that?" Her voice was steady. It was the steadiness of someone maintaining something with effort. "Joffrey is not Robert. Robert did terrible things with method behind them. Joffrey does terrible things because he is constitutionally incapable of restraint when he perceives that he is losing." Robb was quiet for a moment. The river sounds came in through the narrow window. "What if he's already dead, Mother?" he said. It was the first time he had said it. Not because he hadn't thought it. He had thought it every day since the Raven, but because he was 16 and had been playing the role that everyone needed him to play, and the role did not have space in it for that question. Catelyn crossed the room. She held him, briefly, with the particular precision of a woman who knew her son's measurements and exactly where his head came relative to her shoulder. It lasted a moment. Then she stepped back. "Then we do not let it have been for nothing," she said. "That is all. There is no other answer." He nodded. She was right. There was no other answer. Olenna came to Margaery's room after the household had gone to sleep. She did not knock loudly. She did not need to. She sat in the chair by the window, and she did not arrange herself in it. She simply occupied it, the way she occupied everything, completely and without apparent effort. She looked at her granddaughter for a moment without speaking. This was a thing she did when she was deciding which version of what she needed to say to use. "You are going to be queen," she said. "The boy is remarkable, the alliance is sound, but the Lannisters still hold King's Landing, and Ned Stark is still in a cell, and kingdoms are not secured in a season." She folded her hands. "I need to know that you see clearly." "I see clearly," Margaery said. "Then you understand that we need an heir." She said it the way she said most things, as a fact that had finished being a decision some time ago and was now simply true. Sooner rather than later. The alliance is strong while Robb Stark is alive and capable and has a successor. Without an heir, the moment something goes wrong with him, every lord in both kingdoms begins calculating alternatives. "I understand." Olenna studied her for the long moment she used for studying things she actually cared about. "He's handsome, at least," she said. "I've arranged worse. Grandmother, I'm serious. It matters. You're going to spend a great deal of time with this person." She rose from the chair. "Don't mistake practicality for coldness, Margaery. They're not the same thing. I am being practical. What you feel is your own business, as long as it doesn't interfere with what you know." She left. Margaery stood at the window for a time after. The tumblestone moved below, black and quick in the dark. She was thinking about the hall, specifically the moment after the acclamation, when the noise was at its full roar and every lord in the room was looking at the boy standing at the head of the table. She had watched his face, not the public face, the one underneath it, the one that appeared for half a second when he said if a throne is what it takes. The specific weight of a person accepting something enormous, without pretending it was anything other than what it was. Not triumph. She had seen triumph on people's faces. This was not that. She was beginning to understand who he actually was, which was not the same as who she had expected. When she tried to locate the place where she had expected something different, she found she could not find it anymore. The river ran. The castle settled. Somewhere in Riverrune's walls, a king who was 16 years old was sitting with the word throne and working out what it weighed. She went to sleep thinking about what her grandmother had said. She thought Olenna was right, and also that Olenna had missed something, but she didn't yet have the language for what it was. A war map was a lie told in ink. It showed you distances but not the mud between them. It showed you positions but not the hunger of the men holding them. It showed you rivers as clean blue lines without the cold of the water or the weight of armor crossing it. Robb had understood this for years in the abstract, and he understood it now in the specific. Standing over a map of the Riverlands and the Westerlands in Riverrune's planning chamber with Lord Randyll Tarly beside him, and the particular smell of a room that had been used for serious work for 100 years, old paper, candle carbon, river damp. The faint iron residue of decisions that had cost men their lives. Outside, the army was being fed and rested. In 3 days, it would move. Everything that happened after that depended on what was decided in this room. Tarly stood with his arms at his sides rather than crossed. Robb had learned to read the difference. Arms crossed meant Tarly was listening but reserved. Arms at his sides meant he was engaged, that the thing on the table had passed some internal threshold and earned his full attention. 2 movements, Robb said. His finger moved to Harrenhal, the great ruin on the north shore of the God's Eye. We bring the combined host to Harrenhal's perimeter. We do not assault it. He let that settle for a moment, because several of the men around the table had opened their mouths at "do not assault it" and closed them again when his tone established that this was not a question. Harrenhal is not the objective. Tywin Lannister is the objective. Specifically, keeping him where he is. He won't sit behind walls, Tarly said. Not a contradiction. A consideration, offered with the flatness of someone who had studied Tywin Lannister's campaign history and arrived at a conclusion. No, Robb agreed. But he won't march west into the Westerlands and abandon the Riverlands either, because the moment he does, we follow. And he fights on 2 fronts instead of 1. And he won't march north, because north is the wrong direction when his supply lines run south. He is at Harrenhal, because Harrenhal is the best position available to him, and the best position available to him is still a trap. Robb's finger moved south and west, following the Rose Road through the heart of the Reach. Mace Tyrell takes 30,000 south and west. He uses the Rose Road into the Westerlands. He does not engage Casterly Rock directly. He does not need to. The Redwyne Fleet, Tarly said. The Redwyne Fleet positions between Lannisport and open water. Robb lifted his hand from the map. Casterly Rock's gold mines produce gold that cannot reach anyone. The armies cannot be paid. Bannermen, stop answering ravens. You do not need to breach the rock. You only need to make the rock an expensive building on a hill with no one willing to defend it. The room was quiet. Through the window, the tumblestone moved with its cold sound. The timing of the southern march, Tarly said. Tywin will move the moment he understands what we're doing. He has outriders. He will know within a week of Mace's column reaching the Gold Road. Which is why Mace moves first, Robb said. He marches in 4 days. We give him 10 days lead before the northern column presents at Harrenhal. By the time Tywin understands the geometry, the fleet is already in position and Mace is already between him and the Westerlands. Tarly looked at the map. He was doing the distances in his head the way he did everything, quickly and without showing it. After a moment he said, "It works." From Randyll Tarly in this room, with this map, this was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The other lords took their cue from it. The planning moved into execution, which was the stage where Tarly was most comfortable and most useful. And for 2 hours the room was nothing but distances and logistics, and the specific, detailed work of moving a combined force of 60,000 men across the Riverlands without losing a third of them to bad roads and poor provisioning. When the council broke, Tarly paused at the door. He looked back at Robb with the expression he used when he was going to say something he had decided warranted saying. "The 2-pronged plan," he said. "It was in your head when you walked in." "Yes," Robb said. Tarly nodded once. He left. Harrenhal had been cursed since the day Aegon's dragon melted it. The stones of the towers had run like candle wax under Balerion's fire. And when they cooled they had set in those shapes, bent, warped, inhuman, like something that had survived by becoming unrecognizable. 3 centuries of lords had tried to make the castle functional, and 3 centuries of lords had died there or wished they had. The walls were thick enough to make siege almost meaningless. The size of it meant a garrison of 10,000 men still left half the corridors empty. It was, in every practical sense, a magnificent liability. Tywin Lannister did not believe in curses. He believed in position, supply, and the management of uncertainty. Harrenhal gave him position. His supply lines through the Riverlands gave him, for the moment, the second. The third was becoming a problem. He was at his desk when the Outriders' report arrived. He read it without visible change of expression. The Red Wine fleet had repositioned from the arbor north toward Lannisport, moving in the column formation that meant they were not traveling, but deploying. 60 ships, by the Outriders' count. Probably more. He set the report down. He knew what 60 Red Wine ships between Lannisport and the ocean meant. He had known it was a possibility since the moment the Tyrell banners rose for Robb Stark, and knowing it was a possibility and confronting it as a fact were two different experiences, and he sat with the difference for precisely as long as was useful, and then moved past it. He went to the map table. His options resolved themselves the way options resolved under pressure, by elimination. He could break west through the Riverlands and march to relieve Lannisport, but the boys' combined host would follow him, and he would fight 60,000 allied men in open country with 40. He could hold Harrenhal and wait, but waiting meant Casterly Rock's gold becoming decorative within the season. And armies without gold were not armies. He could negotiate, but negotiation acknowledged that the position had closed, and position acknowledgement was leverage surrendered. He stood at the map for a long time. He was not, as some men were in defeat, angry. Anger was information he couldn't afford to spend on himself. He was thinking about his father, about his grandfather, about what the Lannister name had been before Tywin had made it what it was, and what it would become if the making were undone. He was thinking about Cersei, about Jaime in a cage somewhere north of here, about Joffrey on a throne that was rapidly becoming a seat without a floor beneath it. He reached for a piece of parchment. He wrote for 10 minutes. He sealed it with the lion. He called for a raven and gave the handler specific instructions about which bird, not the nearest, not the largest, the one that had flown the eastern routes, the one trained for the distance. The raven went east. The chapter does not say to whom. Lannisport from the water looked prosperous even in autumn. The towers were solid, the harbor wide. The warehouses along the dock faced large enough that their shadows reached the water at certain times of day. The city had the comfortable, settled look of a place that had been wealthy for so long it had stopped noticing its wealth and begun to assume it. The Red Wine fleet sat between the harbor mouth and the open water of the Sunset Sea, with the unhurried placement of something that had been designed specifically to be in that position. 70 galleys in close formation, green-hulled, the arbor sigil on every sail. They were not threatening movement toward the city. They were simply present. The way a locked door was present, without animosity, without negotiation, simply closed. Lord Paxter Redwine read the morning dispatches aboard his flagship in the kind of early light that made the water look like hammered lead. He was a methodical man who had commanded the Arbor fleet for 20 years, and had spent 19 of those years in peacetime, which had given him ample opportunity to maintain and improve a fleet that almost no one needed, and that he had quietly believed for 2 decades would eventually be needed very much. The Lannister boat came under a white flag at the second hour. Small, fast, a delegation of 3, a herald and 2 men there to establish that the herald was serious. The herald carried a sealed scroll, and the expression of a man who had been given an assignment he understood was probably futile. Redwine read the scroll. It offered gold, a significant figure, stated plainly, for a lane of passage south through the fleet, and guaranteed Lannister neutrality toward Redwine shipping lanes for 20 years. It was, as bribes went, a serious attempt. Whoever composed it had understood that the number needed to be large enough to require actual thought. Redwine looked at it for a moment. He looked at his fleet, the masts in every direction, the galleys positioned with the precision of something that had been placed, not arrived. He looked at the harbor mouth where the wealth of the Westerlands sat behind its wall of towers, going nowhere. He had the small boat turned around. "Tell them," he said to the heralds retreating back, "the price has gone up." The fires of Harrenhal were visible from Robb's camp on the south shore of the God's Eye. Not the fires of battle, but the fires of occupation. The warm lights in warped towers that meant Tywin Lannister was in there, and had not yet decided what to do about the army sitting outside his walls. They looked, on dark nights over the water, like something from the stories old Nan had told Robb when he was small, like lights in a place where lights had no right to be. He was sitting outside his tent when Margaery came with something warm, a cup of spiced wine she had requisitioned from somewhere in the camp's supply train, with the efficiency of a person who had learned, in 3 months of campaigning, that supply trains responded to quiet authority more than loud requesting. She sat beside him on the camp stool someone had placed there. Their shoulders were close enough that the cold air between them was a matter of inches. She didn't ask about Harrenhal or the fleet or the timeline. She had been in enough councils to know those answers. She asked, "Tell me about your father." He looked at her. She was watching the lights on the water and she was asking genuinely, which was the thing about her that continued to surprise him at intervals, the moments when the political instrument of her simply stopped running and a person sat there instead, asking real questions. He told her about Ned, not the Lord of Winterfell, not the Hand of the King, not the prisoner in the black cells, his father, the specific man. The godswood after rain, a particular quality of quiet that Ned produced in a room that Robb had never noticed until it was absent. The weight of a sword placed in an 8-year-old's hands and the expression on his father's face when he watched Robb hold it, not expectant, not demanding, something more careful than either of those. The way Ned sat with his hands in the cold pool and faced things he didn't want to face, because facing them was what you did. Margaery listened the way she listened to things that were not about her, completely, without constructing her response while he was still speaking. When he stopped, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When this is over, you should go back to Winterfell and sit in the godswood and talk to him through the heart tree. I think the old gods listen." He looked at her. The fire in front of the tent pushed light across her face, and she was watching the lights on the god's eye, and she had said it without performance, which meant she meant it, which meant something that he was still working out. "Do you believe that?" he said. She considered it. He could see her considering it, the specific honesty of someone running a real question through themselves rather than producing a comfortable answer. "I believe you need to," she said. The Dornish rider arrived at Riverrun's gates in the 3rd week of the siege at Harrenhal, which was to say he arrived when everyone at Riverrun was thinking about Harrenhal and the God's Eye and the fleet reports from Lannisport, and was therefore not thinking about Dorne. This was, Margaery would later understand, probably deliberate. Oberyn Martell had a gift for appearing in the space between attentions. The sun and spear banner on his saddlebag was small but visible if you were looking. The Castellan of Riverrun was not looking. He was managing supply rosters and a dispute between 2 northern lords about firewood allocation, and he processed the rider with the efficiency of a man who had been processing riders for 3 weeks and had developed a system. Message received, recipient identified, delivery assigned. 2 messages. One addressed to King Robb in the formal hand of Dornish court correspondence. One addressed specifically to Lady Margaery in a different hand, smaller, faster, the script of someone for whom writing was a tool and not a performance. The Castellan looked at the second message for a moment. Then he sent both. Margaery read hers first. She was in the room she had taken for her own work, not a solar, not a lady's chamber. A map room that no one had been using because the maps it contained were 20 years out of date, which she had replaced within a week of arriving. She read the message once, the way she read things she needed to think about. Then, she set it face down on the table and sat for a moment with her hands folded and the particular expression she wore when she was ahead of a situation and deciding how far ahead she needed to be. Then she went to find Robb. She told him the Dornish message was courteous but standard. She said she thought the meeting should happen privately before any formal council was arranged. He looked at her the way he looked at her when he understood she was 3 steps into something he had not yet started. Why privately? Because Oberyn Martell writes to 15-year-old girls for a reason, she said, and I'd like to understand the reason before everyone else is in the room. He considered this for a moment. Then he said, "All right." She had known he would. That was not the same as taking it for granted. The room Cersei Lannister occupied in the Red Keep had shrunk in the last month. Not physically. The dimensions were what they had always been: high ceilings, wide windows, the harbor visible beyond the glass. But the space in it that belonged to Cersei's authority had contracted steadily since the Red Wine fleet took its position and the city's grain stores began their slow arithmetic of diminishing. She had been writing to Sunspear for 3 weeks. The letters had gone through 3 separate routes because she did not trust any of them completely. A Dornish merchant in the city. A Pantoshi captain who owed her a favor. A maester's assistant whose loyalty she had purchased 6 months ago against the possibility of exactly this kind of need. She was not, whatever her enemies believed, a woman who failed to plan for contingencies. The offer she made Sunspear was real. Not a feint, not a delay. Real, Gregor Clegane delivered to Dornish justice. She would authorize it herself, put it in writing with the royal seal, bind Joffrey to it in whatever language the lawyers required. Myrcella to Prince Trystane, the betrothal confirmed immediately. And Dornish neutrality in exchange, no Martell banners for Robb Stark. No Dornish soldiers in the Riverlands, Sunspear's spears staying inside Dorne's borders. It was the last card she had. She knew it. She played it anyway, because a last card played with conviction was still a card. She sent the 3rd letter and waited. The answer that came back was not from Doran Martell. It was from Oberyn, which told her something she had not expected. My prince sends his regards. I am riding north. That was all. She read it twice. She put it in the fire. Then she sat at her window and looked at the harbor and understood, in the particular way that very intelligent people understood the moments when they had been outmaneuvered, that someone had gotten to Oberyn Martell before her letter arrived. The question was who? And the answer, when she turned it over carefully, was not difficult. The Tyrell girl. Oberyn Martell in Riverrun's map-room was not what the map-room expected. He wore Dornish silk under a riding cloak, and the riding cloak had dust on it from 3 days at speed, and his eyes moved around the room the way a predator's eyes moved. Not hunting, just cataloging, maintaining the habit of knowing where the exits were and what stood between him and them. He was 41 years old, and had been in more rooms that turned dangerous without warning than most men twice his age. He had agreed to a private meeting because the message had been signed in Margaery's own hand and contained 2 pieces of information that should not have been available to a girl who had been in the Reach when they were discovered. She had made a point of that. He respected the point. She was at the map table when he entered. A maester's assistant sat in the corner with a quill, the presence of a witness making the meeting formal without making it public. She gestured to the chair across from her. He sat. He looked at her. She was 15. He had known this, but knowing the age and encountering the person were, as always, different experiences. She was composed in the particular way that very young people were composed when they had been trained by someone exceptional. The stillness was real, but you could see the architecture beneath it, the places where the training held something in place. She put a scroll on the table. Cersei's offer, she said. Gregor Clegane, delivered for Dornish justice. Myrcella to Trystane, the betrothal in writing with the royal seal. Dornish neutrality in exchange. He looked at the scroll without touching it. You obtained the Lannister correspondence. I know what the Lannister correspondence says, she corrected, which was not the same thing and they both knew it. It arrived before yours. He studied her for a moment. And you arranged this meeting to tell me what they offered. I arranged this meeting to tell you what they offered, she said, and then to offer you something better. She put a second document beside the first. Dorne recognized as a formal partner in the New Realm's governance, a seat on the council, not a courtesy appointment. Dornish legal customs preserved in Dorne without question or condition. Whatever role Oberyn named for himself, in whatever capacity he considered most useful. He read it again. He looked at the last clause, which was the shortest. That is everything Cersei offered, he said. Yes, Margaery said. And one thing she cannot. She let the pause do its work. You want justice for Elia, she said. Not neutrality. Not a betrothal and a delivered body after Dornish soldiers have gone home, and the Lannister wars are settled, and 20 years have passed between the crime and the accounting. Justice. She held his gaze. The man who gave the order is in the field right now. He has 40,000 men and nowhere to go, and 2 armies closing the distance. We are going to catch him. She paused once more. I want you to be in the room." The map room was quiet. Rain had started on the river beyond the window. Oberyn was still for a long moment. He was not the kind of man who showed his thinking, but she had been watching him with complete attention since he sat down, and she saw the thing his face did, the specific tightening around his eyes that was not anger, or not only anger. Something beneath the anger, something older. A wound that had never been treated because there had never been a treatment available. "The Tyrell girl," he said, "is sharper than her grandmother lets on." "My grandmother," Margaery said, "lets on exactly as much as she chooses." He looked at her for another moment. Then something in his posture changed. Not much, but measurably. The decision made. "I have conditions," he said. "Name them." Robb met Oberyn in the Great Hall an hour later with Tarly at his left and Grey Wind at his feet, and the expression he had developed for men he did not yet have a reading on. Open, watchful, deliberately without conclusion. Oberyn walked in and looked at the wolf first, then at Robb. "Younger than I expected," Oberyn said. "You're older than I expected," Robb said. Oberyn's mouth moved in something that was adjacent to a smile. "Dornishmen age differently," he said. "The sun preserves us. What do you want from this alliance?" Robb said. He had learned, in 4 months of managing lords who said 12 things before arriving at the one they meant, to start where the conversation was going to end anyway. Oberyn considered him. He was testing for the idealism without substance, the young king who had righteous positions and no follow-through, who would give speeches about justice and then discover reasons why the difficult parts required delays. He had met Robb's type before. Usually they were talking to him, not listening. Robb was listening. "What do you offer a Prince of Dorne?" Oberyn said. "A seat at the table," Robb said. "And the truth." "What truth?" "That the Lannisters made your family pay a price no family should pay, and that the man who decided they would pay it is running out of room." He did not look away. "If you wait, if you come with us, you will be in the room when he answers for it. Not the answer that takes 20 years and goes through 7 layers of process. The answer that happens because we caught him and you were there, and the law of the new realm is that what was done to your sister cannot be done without consequence." Oberyn was quiet. He looked at the wolf again. Grey Wind looked back at him without movement, pale eyes steady. "Dorne will march," Oberyn said. Olenna came to Margaery's rooms before supper. She did not sit. She stood at the center of the room and she looked at her granddaughter with the expression she used for things that required a particular precision of response. "You invited the Red Viper to Riverrun," she said, "without consulting me." "You would have said no," Margaery said. "I would have said no immediately," Olenna said. "And then I would have thought about it for 2 days, and said yes." A pause. "The rain on the window. The result is the same. The process matters. We didn't have 2 days." "No," Olenna said. "You didn't." She walked to the window. She looked at the river in the rain. "Cersei moved first. If you had waited for me, we would have been responding to what Dorne decided, rather than deciding for them." She was quiet for a moment. "Don't do it again." Margaery said she wouldn't. Olenna turned from the window. She looked at her granddaughter for a long moment, with the particular expression she used for things she had decided to say aloud, rather than keep in the chamber where she kept most of her real feelings. "You did well," she said. From Olenna Tyrell in a private room to a girl she had raised and sharpened and sent north into the cold. These 3 words were the full architecture of love made as useful as it could be made. Margaery understood this. She had understood it since she was small. "Thank you," she said. Olenna picked up her cloak. At the door she paused, which she did when something had occurred to her that she had not planned to say but had decided to say anyway. "Cersei Lannister is intelligent," she said. "I want you to remember that. She is intelligent, and she is cornered, and cornered intelligent people do not become less dangerous when they run out of options. They become a different kind of dangerous." She looked at Margaery steadily. "Watch the city. Something will happen there that we have not planned for." She left. Margaery stood in the quiet room with the rain on the window and the maps on the table, and the knowledge that Dorne was marching and Harrenhal was closing, and somewhere in the capital, a woman who was not stupid was looking at a door that was sealing shut from the outside. She thought about what Olenna had said. She sat down at the table and pulled the nearest map toward her, and began to think about King's Landing not as a target, but as a container, and about what a desperate, intelligent woman might do with a city full of people, and a harbor full of ships, and a secret she had been protecting for 17 years. She thought for a long time. The candle burned down a finger's width before she found the shape of what worried her. When she found it, she sat very still. Then she reached for a piece of parchment and began to write. The bells of the great sept began before dawn. They rang the way bells rang in a city that had been afraid for a long time and was being given permission to stop, not cautiously, not building gradually, but all at once and fully, the sound occupying the sky above King's Landing from the first stroke. It moved through Flea Bottom before the sun cleared the bay. It moved through the street of steel and the street of silk and the market warrens and the harbor front, and the city, which had survived 3 weeks of siege and 2 months of hunger and 17 years of a reign that had slowly ground itself to pieces, came to its doorways and listened. Olenna had arranged the bread before the ceremony. This had not been negotiable. She had put it to Robb with the economy of a woman who understood logistics better than most generals. A city given food and then a wedding was a city that associated the wedding with the food, and that association was worth 20 speeches about the new reign's intentions. The Tyrell grain wagons had moved through the streets at first light, and by the time the bells started, the smell of bread was already in the air. Robb had agreed without argument, which was what he did when he encountered an idea that was obviously correct. The great sept of Baelor, the largest sept in the Seven Kingdoms, held thousands when pressed. It was pressed today. Lords and ladies of 3 kingdoms occupied the central space. Stark gray alongside Tyrell green, alongside the copper and gold of Dorne, the colors working against each other at the edges, and somehow resolving in the center into something that had never existed before. Farther back, the city's guild masters, the harbor masters, the senior servants of the Red Keep, and at the very rear, pressed close to the walls, ordinary people who had simply walked in when the doors were opened and found that no one was stopping them, which was itself a statement about what this reign intended. Walder Frey occupied a seat near the middle. He clapped at appropriate intervals, and his eyes never warmed once. There were 2 ceremonies. The Septon's rite came first, the 7 present, candles lit at each altar. The formal words in the high tongue that the southern lords expected and the reach required. Margaery went through it with the ease of someone who had practiced these precise words, which she had, and with something underneath the ease that was not practice, which the Septon, performing his 100th wedding, noticed and privately thought was the best thing he had seen at the Sept in years. The northern moment came after, private. The assembly instructed to remain seated while a second brief ceremony was conducted at the altar's side. Ned stood before his son and his son's new wife with a weirwood sprig and 3 words in the old tongue that had been spoken over generations of Stark marriages in the Godswood at Winterfell. The words were short. The old gods did not require speeches. They required presence and sincerity, and both were present. Robb took Margaery's hand. He said what needed to be said. She said what needed to be said. That was the whole of it. The cloaking was the moment the great hall watched. Robb settled the grey wolf cloak across Margaery's shoulders, heavy northern wool. The dire wolf worked in silver thread, the weight of it considerable. And she received it without adjusting it, without managing it, without performing the receiving of it. She simply wore it. And the assembled lords of 3 kingdoms watched a Tyrell girl from the warmest part of the realm stand in a dead king's religious house, in a northern cloak, and look like she had always been exactly where she was. The bells again, and this time the hall joined them. The feast that followed occupied every hall in the Red Keep that could be made to hold tables. Olenna had managed the seating with the precision of someone who understood that proximity was politics and had no intention of allowing politics to be accidental. She had placed Ned Stark beside herself. This had been her decision, and no one had thought to question it, which was the most reliable indicator of where the room's actual authority resided. They were not natural conversationalists. Ned was northern and precise and had no gift for elaboration. Olenna spoke in elaboration the way others breathed. They sat together for the first 20 minutes with the slightly careful quality of people who had heard a great deal about each other and were in the process of discovering what was true. Then Olenna said, "You wrote to us in August." "Yes," Ned said. The scroll was well constructed, formal without being desperate. She lifted her cup. Desperation in correspondence is the most expensive thing a man can put in a letter. You avoided it. "I had help," Ned said. "Luwin, I know his style." She looked at Ned steadily. "You wrote it yourself." Luwin adjusted the language. "The substance was yours." He said nothing. "The offer was also correct," she said. "Not generous. Correct, there is a difference. Generous offers require evaluation. Correct ones close themselves." She looked out at the hall, at the assembled company, at everything that had followed from a letter sent in the small hours of a Winterfell morning. "You did not know us." "No," Ned said. "You understood us anyway." She was quiet for a moment. "I have dealt with a great number of lords in my life. Most of them understand people they already know. What you did requires a different quality." She looked at him. "Your son has it as well. The Tyrell gift is charm. The Stark gift, it seems, is clarity." Ned considered this for a moment. "You overestimate the gift," he said. "I was afraid. Afraid men think clearly about what they cannot control and stop worrying about what they can." Olenna looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes, that is exactly right," and she said nothing more about it, which meant she had filed it in the place where she filed things she intended to remember. Across the hall, in the seats that had been arranged for family rather than rank, Sansa and Arya sat together. Sansa wore a dress in stark gray that had been made for her in the Tyrell household 3 weeks ago, measured precisely. Sewn with the attention to detail that Margaery's attendants brought to everything, it fit. Arya wore northern clothes with a single Tyrell rose pinned at the collar, which had been Margaery's delivery that morning, presented without comment, directly, with a look that said it was a joke and also not a joke, and Arya could decide which mattered more to her. Arya had pinned it on. They were not talking much. They had been talking for 3 days, since the passages and the black cells and the walk back up into the light, and the talking had covered most of the necessary ground. What was left was the kind of company that didn't require conversation, the particular ease of two people who knew each other completely and were simply occupying the same space. After a while, Arya said, "She's good." Sansa knew she meant Margaery. "Yes," she said. She knew things. Arya was looking at the high table, about King's Landing, about the Red Keep. She knew things she shouldn't have been able to know from Riverrun. "She arranged people," Sansa said, "before she even arrived. She had people here watching before Robb's army was assembled." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't understand that for weeks. Then I realized her letters knew things that nobody had told her." Arya thought about this. "That's useful. That is the most useful thing I have ever seen anyone do," Sansa said, with a specificity of feeling that surprised even her. They sat with that. The feast moved around them, loud, celebratory. The particular noise of a large number of people who had been afraid for a long time and had been given a day to set it down. The morning after, the small council chamber. Ned sat his hand, the chain of office new enough that it still felt unfamiliar at his collar. Tarly at the table, Lord Commander of the combined forces until permanent arrangements were made. Oberyn to his right, no title yet, his own insistence, pending the proceedings in Sunspear which would begin within the month. Olenna without a title, because she had declined every offer with the patience of someone who found titles limiting. Margaery between Olenna and Robb, a maester at the corner table recording. The map of Westeros was spread in the center. It was a different map from the one in Riverrun. Newer, updated, marked in 3 colors of ink to show the current positions of forces and houses and outstanding complications. There were 3. The Vale was the first. Lysa Tully had sealed the Bloody Gate and stopped receiving ravens. She had not answered Catelyn's letters. She had not answered Robb's. She had answered Littlefinger's, which told you everything useful. The decision, leave the Vale alone for now. The mountain passes would close with the winter snows within weeks. Lysa was contained by geography and could be managed in the spring with patience and Catelyn's connection. It was not a resolution. It was a deferral with a timeline. The Iron Islands were the second. Balon Greyjoy had declared himself King of the Iron Islands, which he had also done during Robert's reign, and which he would, given sufficient opportunity, do under any reign that offered him the possibility. Robb's position: acknowledge the islands as a regional lordship with significant autonomy in exchange for a non-aggression pact and the formal release of Theon, who was still at Winterfell and was technically still a ward of a rebellious house. The arrangement did not satisfy anyone completely, which meant it was probably the correct arrangement. Theon would be a complication. Everyone in the room knew this. No one said it, because some complications were better held in reserve. The third was the wall. But before it could be raised, Tarly spoke to a related matter. "Dragonstone," he said. He looked at the map. "Stannis Baratheon holds it. He holds it alone, his support among the great houses is minimal, and without southern allies his position is weak. But the island sits on obsidian deposits the Night's Watch cannot afford to be without." He looked at Robb steadily. "Stannis is not a man who bends easily. But he is a man who calculates. Offer him the right terms, and he has every reason to deal rather than oppose." Robb looked at the map. Stannis Baratheon, Robert's older brother, the rightful heir before Joffrey's claim had poisoned the succession. A man known for rigid justice and no patience for politics. A man who would have a claim if he chose to press it, and enough stubbornness to press it badly. "What does he want?" Robb asked. "Recognition," Margaery said, without hesitation. "He has always believed the throne should have been his by rights when Robert died. He will not ask for it now, the numbers do not favor it, but he will want to be seen as something more than a footnote. Give him a formal title. Lord Paramount of the Stormlands. Let him keep his dignity and the obsidian flows to the wall." "And if he refuses?" Ned asked. "He won't," Tarly said. "He will deliberate for 3 weeks and then calculate that refusal costs more than acceptance. That is how Stannis Baratheon makes every decision." Robb nodded. "Send a raven. Offer the terms. Frame it as an alliance, not a submission." He looked at the map one last time. "And while we wait for his answer, the wall." The raven from Castle Black had arrived before the feast. Robb had read it, and Ned had read it, and they had agreed without discussion to leave it for this morning's council, because some things needed daylight and a full table. Robb placed it in the center of the map. Commander Mormont had written with the economy of a man who did not have the luxury of elaborate phrasing. Ranging parties were not returning. The wildlings were moving south, not raiding, moving, which was different and worse. 3 rangers had reported seeing things beyond the Fist of the First Men that they had refused to describe in writing. The wall held. The Watch was reduced to its lowest numbers in a generation. He was not asking for sympathy. He was providing information. The table read it in order. Tarly last, because Tarly read things fully before he said anything about them. When he set it down, he said, "Dragonglass." Robb looked at him. "The obsidian at Dragonstone," Tarly said. "There are records in the Citadel. Weapons made from it have historically been effective against things that should not be encountered north of the wall." He said this in the flat way he said things he had verified and considered and arrived at. "Once Stannis comes to terms, we begin mining immediately. Supply lines to Castle Black before the passes close." Ned said, "You believe the reports." Tarly looked at him. "I believe men who refuse to write what they saw," he said. "That is a different category of report." The room was quiet. Robb looked at the map, at the wall, that thin line across the north's top edge, at the enormous space beyond it. He had spent a year learning to read what maps didn't show, the mud between positions, the hunger of men, the things that existed outside the clean ink lines. He looked at the space beyond the wall and thought about what might exist there that was too large to put on a map. He said, "Dragonstone first, terms to Stannis, then a mining operation, supply lines established before the snows closed the roads. We move that fast." He looked at Tarly. "Can we?" "If we move this week," Tarly said. "Then we move this week." Robb looked around the table. "We send men and supplies to Castle Black before the mountain passes close. We double the Watch's current numbers by calling for volunteers, paid volunteers, with families provided for, not criminals looking for alternatives to execution." He paused. "The Watch has been a dumping ground. That stops. Ned was watching his son, not speaking. Robb looked at Oberyn. Dorne has knowledge of things older than the maesters write down. I would like to access that knowledge. Oberyn said, I will write to my brother. Thank you. Robb looked at the map one last time. Then he rolled it and handed it to the maester and looked at the table of people who had, over the course of a year, become the architecture of something new. We have a kingdom, he said. We have grain and armies and a fleet and an agreement with Dorne that holds. We have a wall that has protected this continent for 8,000 years, and a commander who is telling us it needs help. He looked at each of them in turn. We help it. Whatever it costs, whatever it requires. We do not wait until we understand the full scope of it. We move now with what we know, and we learn the rest as we go. Nobody argued. Tarly was already calculating logistics. Oberyn was already composing the letter to Sunspear in his head. That evening Robb stood at the window of the chamber that had become his working room, not the throne room, not the Lord's Solar, a plain room with a good table and a view of the harbor. The Redwyne fleet was still visible at anchor in the bay, green-hulled ships resting in the last of the autumn light. The city below was quieter than it had been in months. Not silent, King's Landing was never silent, but a different quality of noise, the noise of a place that had resumed normal function. Margaery came in with a candle. She had been with Olenna for the last hour. She set the candle on the table and came to stand beside him at the window without asking what he was looking at, because she already knew. She had been learning what he looked at from windows for months, and it was always the same thing. The distance, the space between here and the next thing that needed doing. The Vale in spring, she said. Yes, your mother will manage Lisa. She looked at the harbor. Catelyn Tully understands her sister's particular weaknesses in a way that no political approach replicates. I know. He was quiet for a moment. The wall. The wall, she agreed. He looked at her. She was watching the harbor lights come up as the dark settled, her face in the candlelight doing what it did in private, setting down the management of it, and being simply a person looking at the world. She had been 15 when she arrived in Winterfell in a carriage that smelled of rosewater. She was 16 now and had marched with an army and managed Dornish negotiations and built an intelligence network inside a hostile capital and stood in a sept today and said words that meant she was bound to the north for the rest of her life. He thought about the godswood, the laugh in the dark, the specific moment before he understood what was happening. When she had said something about her grandmother and he had simply responded without thinking about what he was saying, which was the most honest he had ever been with anyone outside his family. He said, "It was better than I expected." She knew what he meant. She did not pretend otherwise. She looked at him and said, "Yes, it was." The harbor lights multiplied below them as the city went about its evening. The Redwyne ship sat in the bay. Somewhere to the north, beyond the neck in the Wolf's Wood and the long miles of road that led eventually to Winterfell, and beyond that to the wall, and whatever the wall was holding at bay, something was moving in the long dark that no army of men had yet been asked to face together. They had grain, they had armies, they had a fleet and a council and an alliance that covered the length of the continent. They had dragonglass being arranged before the week was out. They had a kingdom that had not existed a year ago and was now real enough that its enemies had accepted its reality. They had each other, which was the thing neither of them had planned for and both of them had needed. Robb looked north one last time. Then he turned from the window. "Come," he said. "There's work in the morning." She picked up the candle and followed him back to the table, and they sat down together, and they began. The summer of Robb Stark was over. The winter of King Robb had just begun. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.